Goeienaand, good evening fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And this again is another huge shout out to Fiona. She sent me another one of her fascinating articles on the Zulu life, seeing that she is known as the White Zulu. Now she started off this article by posing a question to me. So I need to just air this with everybody who watches this video, just so we understand where this is coming from, okay? She says, Scott, I don't know whether you can use the word umuntu. I'm going to leave that up to you to decide, as because these exchanges took place in the 1950s right through to 1994. I've written my parents' conversations verbatim, as it is a true account of my own memories. Now, this channel is known for being basically quite politically incorrect. You know, we're not a rabid lefty channel. We basically call a spade, and you know, historically this is how things played out, so this is how we're going to report it. You know, all those bleeding hearts, just suck it up, buttercup. Now, carrying on with that, the word umuntu, okay? Now, what Fiona says is that the word munt is an abbreviation of umuntu, the Zulu word for a black person, which they always used to refer to each other. Similarly, they called a white person umlungu. Neither term is particularly derogatory, nor is it polite, even though umlungu translates as dog shit that has bleached white in the sun. Okay, so that's a literal translation of umlungu. So if you call that by a black person in South Africa, you know what they're saying now. Anyway, let's get back to the article. But since very few whites speak or understand pure Zulu, they don't know that. We who know the language never used either term to each other. We could say to one another, Nans umuntu, meaning there's a black person, the same way as they'd refer to having seen a strange umlungu driving up the back to the sheds. The K word, as every South African knows, the very worst a white could call a black person to his face or about him, and even mum and dad never used the word in front of us children. They referred to them as Ks or the K word, even the K factor, when any machinery broke down when the Zulus were operating it. So let's just get that clear. When I use the word umuntu in this article or in this video, there's nothing derogatory in that term. It's a word that just means black person, okay? Just for the bleeding hearts to understand that. All right, now let's start the article. Now we got that out the way. Fiona says, my earliest recollections are of Evelina, my Zulu nanny, singing a quiet lullaby while she did the ironing. I would have been about 2 years old. And she sung, Tula Tula Wemtwana Musukala. And in English that means hush, hush baby, do not cry. And then the second line is Izo Figa Ubaba Musukala. And that means in English, Daddy will come, do not cry. Her voice was as rich as dark treacle, and she swayed her hips slightly as she sang. She tied me to her back the way Zulu women traditionally carry their infants, piggyback, and strapped on with a big woolen shawl while she rhythmically took the flat irons in turn off the fiercely hot biela, or corruption of boiler, our wood stove, and thumped them, gently hissing, onto the still damp linen. Now, I have to tell you that when I was in South Africa, and I lived in this little town called Greytown, and we had a domestic lady, African lady, who was fantastic in the kitchen. The way she could mash potatoes was something, a joy to behold, absolutely amazing. But she used to sing too. And I know exactly what Fiona's talking about, because she'd sing these Zulu songs, and she would be kind of dancing to them as she was singing. It was absolutely fascinating. Anyway, let's get back to Fiona's story. She says, "My little legs stuck out on either side of her plump back as I rested on her warm, cushiony rump. My head was nestled on her shoulder, and sleepily I savoured her familiar, faint African smell, slightly musky with a touch of an unidentifiable spice, a bit like cinnamon and wood smoke, which I loved so much. It was almost overwhelmed, though, by the sharper scent of Lifebuoy soap, with which my mother insisted her house servants bathed every day, since she couldn't stand the smell of them. She'd wrinkle her nose. They stink, especially the farm ones. The farm staff weren't allowed in the house and had to stand outside on the back lawn beyond the kitchen veranda, twisting their khaki cotton hats in their black hands, waiting anxiously while the house staff relayed their messages or requests to one of my parents. Mum and Dad regularly, at least every month during the summer, held tennis and lunch parties. On Saturdays they'd invite neighbouring ranchers from as far away as Moy River and Escort for a few sets on our tennis court, with drinks on the veranda afterwards. My grandmother had 2 tennis courts built. She felt that, since it was such a long way for the guests to have to travel on our terrible roads, just rutted tracks in those days, by horse and carriage, it seemed a pity for them to have to sit and watch rather than play. By the time I was born, we were reduced to just 1 grass court. These activities were followed by a hearty lunch of roast mutton from one of our merino sheep, accompanied by roast potatoes and vegetables from our garden. Pudding was usually Masango's speciality, a fluffy banana souffle, slathered with rich yellow cream from our dairy cows. Sometimes they would host a whole weekend, again, always for adults only. These were their city friends and various cousins from Durban and Pietermaritzburg. On all these occasions, we children were to be neither seen nor heard. My 2 older sisters were at boarding school, and my little sister and I would play quietly all morning with our nannies, out of sight, usually beyond the thatched stables behind the homestead. We'd hear the occasional pock-pock of tennis balls and shouts and laughter from the players. Evelina would give us a nursery lunch in our playroom behind the kitchen, and afterwards, when Mum gave Masanga the signal to serve lunch to the guests in the dining room, would race around the lawns that skirted the house to the front veranda. There would drink the dregs from all the glasses, before Evelina, who was helping wash pots in the kitchen, could catch us. Feeling slightly woozy from snatched mouthfuls of pink gin, castle lager and whiskey and soda, we would trail after her as she took us to her home at the kraal, a cluster of mud huts on a slope behind the farmhouse, beneath the tall, rustling gum trees. There would find a different kind of party. The Zulu women had swept clean a large area of bare earth in front of their huts, with brooms made from twigs tied together. They had dragged gum logs into a pile in the centre, made a big fire and added eucalyptus branches to create leaping flames. The smoke filled the compound with its unique, spicy, aromatic blue scent. The women all sat around the fire in a wide circle on grass mats. With their palms, 2 of them beat drums, made from carved hollow logs, with animal hide tightened over it. The men sat on their haunches in a group, passing round a calabash gourd filled with amahu, or corn beer. We children danced while the women sang in harmony and clapped their hands to the rhythm of the drum. Jabu, Tandi, Umbolwe, Dusimani, Makalaza and I did the traditional Zulu jiga dance, arms outstretched in front of us, fists clenched firmly and knees bent. We kicked our legs high, bringing our bare feet thumping down to the earth. As the afternoon wore on, the pace would quicken and the drum beats would become more and more frenzied as the orange-flamed spirits jumped higher into the dusk, sparks flying where one of the women kicked a log further into the centre of the blaze. While my little sister dozed in Evelina's lap, we whirled and crouched at a dizzying speed as our dancing became more abandoned. Puffs of grey dust flew up as I stamped my small bare feet on the hard, dry ground, I spun in circles around the big fire, kicking so high my feet were sometimes above my head, as I and my fellow dancers were spurred on by the faster beating drums and hand clapping. Eventually, panting and dusty, I was led quickly back to the house at nightfall, my sleepy sister tied on Evelina's back in a woolen shawl to be bathed and given supper. Then, scrubbed pink and in our cotton pyjamas, we spent our obligatory hour in the sitting room, sitting quietly while my mother yawned between sips of her first of 2 mandatory evening drinks and read us a story about one of our children books. This was the only social time we spent with our parents at the end of the day, with our storybooks on our laps. Mum would look at Dad over her reading glasses, the ice cubes tinkling in her cut glass tumbler, as she took a sip of a whiskey and water and saying to him crossly, "Do you hear those blasted drums? They go on all night, you know. They drive me mad." Dad rustled his newspaper impatiently and replied curtly, "They're off duty, and anyway there's nothing I can do. Just leave it." I kept quiet. Late into the night I would lie in bed listening to the drums, letting their quick thump, thump, thump lull me to sleep. All the years I spent on the farm, every Saturday and Sunday night, I fell asleep to the comforting sound of drumming up at the huts, knowing that everybody there was dancing around the big open fire. As occasionally happened, Dad received a message from Jamela via one of the herdsmen that there was a problem with a couple of our sheep, and he is driving the old Willie's Jeep up, taking me to the back to open the gates. We went to Jamela's hut where it sat, perched right on the edge of the escarpment, overlooking the neighbourhood Durrant's farm, and right over to Lyons Bush and Fort Nottingham, where Grandpa lived by then. If it was a very clear day, we could see the white buildings of Hilton College in the far distance, about 50 miles away. The hut, with its few pens and a crush tacked on behind for lambing ewes and sheep that needed treatment, was half surrounded by a very necessary windbreak of massive gum trees planted by Grandpa at the same time as he had planted those around our house. This gave some shelter from the icy winds that came whipping down from the snow-covered Drakensberg in winter, and also prevented Jamela's hut from being buried in snow, as he had had a couple of wives and several children living with him, who stayed there all the year round, and remained behind when he brought the sheep down into the valley for inoculations, shearing, dipping, and to be taken to be sold at the stockyard in Nottingham Road. Sadly, the big busy stockyard with its big auction ring situated opposite the equally busy main railway line from Durban to Johannesburg has lain in ruins for the last 20 years. It's a depressing sight. Weeds and kikuyu grass have overrun the place, rather like our cattle crush and dipping tanks on the farm. After too much stock theft post-1994, as Dad was forced to do, all the other farmers we knew in the Midlands got rid of their entire herds. Jamela was waiting to meet us and showed us the 2 sheep he had found in trouble and had carried over his shoulders to the pens behind his hut. The first had been attacked by one of the more black-backed jackals. Because they're smallish predators, about half the size of a sheep, their method of killing was to hamstring the back leg of the animal by biting, and then once it was down, eat as much flesh as it could manage. In the spring, which was now, they carried meat back in their bellies for their pups, disgorging it once they reached the den. All this time the poor unfortunate sheep remained alive. There it lay with one back leg eaten almost right off, leaving just the white shin bone, tendon and hoof still kicking. After a nod from Dad, Jamela quickly cut its throat and hung it down from a wire hook on a nearby gum tree branch to drain the blood out. The rest of the meat could be salvaged and shared out among our family, the farm manager, and all the Zulu staff. The second sheep had fly strike. This was uncommon up in the cooler veld of Lyndhurst, as Up on Top was formerly called, because the blowflies preferred the moister heat of the valleys. But this sheep had had diarrhea, and blowflies had laid their eggs in the matted wool and fecal matter under the cropped tail. We always removed the tails of our lambs for this very reason, snipping them off with a pair of sheep shears just after they were born. The maggots had eaten their way right into the sheep's flesh, leaving a small, deep hole in its backside and groin. The entire wound was a heaving mass of wriggling white maggots. Jamila fetched a tin of Jay's fluid and diluted it with a little water from the nearby rain barrel. He poured the mixture over the maggots, and they began to fall off and writhe on the grass. He repeated this procedure until there was a mere 100 or so maggots left in the gaping but clean pink wound. He then picked up a stick, round the end of which he had twisted a generous hank of sheep's wool. Using it like a paintbrush, he dipped the woolly end into the jays and gently and carefully brushed out the last maggots. Dad told him to hoist both the jackal-eaten sheep and the blowfly one into the back of the jeep, and he got into the driver's seat and started the engine. "Wait, Nkosazana, I have something for you," said Jamila softly to me, and he went back into his hut, reappearing with a Hessian sack loosely tied at the neck. "What is it?" I asked him. "Wait and see when you get home," he said, and I thanked him before I climbed into the cab with Dad, and we set off bumping over the veldt and down the twisting steep road back to the valley. The trip would take at least 3/4 of an hour, and I wasn't going to wait that long to look in the sack. I pried open the strings holding the sack together and stuck my hand inside. I reached warm fur, softer than any kitten's, and feeling curious around, I felt 2 tiny little forms that moved and nudged at my fingers. I opened the sack a little further, folding back the neck, and there sat 2 baby scrub hares, not too young to have been taken away from their mother. They had bright little eyes and lovely snuffly noses. "Jamila must have hand-raised them," chuckled Dad, when I showed him my treasure. "He's a decent old Munty, that one. Definitely got a gift with animals. I don't think I've ever lost an orphan lamb since I've had him. He must have raised them on ewe's milk." I was delighted with my 2 new pets and stroked them all the way home, luxuriating in the feel of their softness, and enjoying the fact that they were completely unafraid of me. Their breathing was normal and contented, not the rabid, heavy, heaving panting of a terrified animal. "I love Jamila," I said happily as we bounced down the road at crawling pace. "Umuntu are strange people," mused Dad, "for once, in spite of having lost a sheep to a jackal and almost one to blowfly." He was in a fairly expansive mood. "We usually drove in silence if I was in the cab. That's why I always preferred to ride on the back with the dogs. We hadn't brought them this time, as our trip up there was to work on sick sheep, and they'd just have been a nuisance." If you're a white man, you'll never get to understand them unless you've grown up with them, like your great-grandfather, Grandpa and I did, and like you are now. His silence after that remark made me think he'd stopped talking, but when I stole a sideways glance at him, he was looking into the distance, far beyond the rutted track in front of the jeep, and obviously thinking. "You need to know their ways, as they do things completely opposite to us. Abalungu." I nodded. I often saw Dad discussing matters with Ngidi or the other staff, like his polo grooms. He continued, "For instance, if you're interviewing Umuntu for a job, say, and he comes around to your office, the first thing he will do when it's his turn to see you is to sit down on the ground. Now that's because in Zulu custom, it's forbidden for anyone to be physically above his elder, especially his chief, who will always be sitting on some kind of stool. A white man will stand up when someone important comes into his presence. That's the first problem that occurs. The white thinks the Umuntu is too lazy or cheeky to stand up." Again I nodded, fondling the tiny velvety ears I had between my fingers. I'd always understood why the staff sat down on the grass in front of Dad's office. "The other thing is that a Umuntu must never look an elder in the eye, as that constitutes a challenge," continued Dad as he wrestled the play on the jeep's loose steering over the ruts and the holes in the road, trying not to bump the maggoty sheep around in the back too badly. He continued, "Whites interpret that as looking shifty and won't employ them. Even someone or even something as simple as a handshake between a white and a black man is complicated. We just shake hands, But they have a special handshake, and each maneuver has to be followed carefully. This leads to all kinds of problems unless each party knows the other ritual. I know about that handshake, I said. Dumasani taught me ages ago. I was about to elaborate, but remembered that I wasn't supposed to associate with Dumi and his ilk, so I quickly stopped and let Dad continue. If a umuntu gives you something, like a piece of paper containing a reference, or the hat you've dropped, or anything for that matter, there is a ritual in a way in which he gives the item. He offers it in his right hand with his left hand clasped on his arm, just under and behind the wrist. This is an ancient ritual, and they do it to one another too. It indicates that he is not intending to harm you, and that his left hand is visible and not holding a weapon. Evelina doesn't do that with us, I said. That's because even though you're white, you're still a child. She'll follow the proper rituals when you get older, replied Dad. How much older, I asked. This ought to have been my last question, as I knew Dad could so easily become irritated by what he was considering pestering. He said, when you reach the age of about 15, I suppose, that's when the Zulus consider their children to become adults. I kept quiet after that, and only jumped out to open and close 3 or 4 gates on the rest of the road home. When we got back, Dad drove the Jeep into its little thatched garage and sent Micaiah off to the manager's cottage with a message about the sick sheep. I took my sack carefully back to the house to show Evelina my new pets. Mum was passing by and peered into the sack too. She said, "You'd better share them with your sisters. I'm sure Jamela didn't give them to you for yourself." "They'll be all you four's pets as far as I'm concerned," Mum said. I was horrified. They were my baby scrub hairs. Jamela had said nothing about sharing them with my sisters, but I knew better than to argue with Mum, so I nodded and continued showing them to Evelina. She was less than impressed, as baby hairs were meant for the cooking pot, as far as she was concerned, but she was pleased that I was so ecstatic with them. She said kindly, "Go and show them to Micaiah, and he'll make a place for them to live. And then come back and have your bath. You're covered in sheep dung from that sack." Once Micaiah had come back from his messenger's run, I intercepted him on the back veranda. There was no way I was taking the hares into the kitchen for Masango to see. He would have their heads off and skinned ready for supper before I could blink my eyes. I showed him the contents of the sack. "How? Izongwacha." Scott, it's pronounced easy. No, God. Okay, I get it. It's pronounced easy, no gotcha. Okay, I'll say that all again, guys. "How? Easy no gotcha," he exclaimed. I told him that they were a gift to me from Jamela, and we needed to get a place for them to stay. Even though it was late afternoon, Micaiah quickly managed to knock up a wonderful hock made from pine planks. It was a square run, about the size of one of our big Persian rugs, with chicken wire all around it, even on the bottom, so the hares couldn't burrow out. Neither could what Mum called hawks, but were actually yellow-billed kites, swoop down from the gum trees and snatch the little hares. I helped him carry it down to the lawn, next to our tennis court, and he then put the finishing touches to it. A piece of corrugated iron was wired onto the top in one corner for shelter for the rain. A wooden box was placed underneath that, filled with lucerne and hay for food and warm bedding, as well as a square 5-gallon tin, which had once contained sunflower cooking oil, which Micaiah had cut in half and carefully washed out. This he wired into another corner of the run for their drinking water. Being square, they wouldn't be able to knock it over, and we could fill it easily through the chicken wire. The best part of all was that the lawn's lush green kikuyu grass sprang through the wire on the bottom of the run, and so the hares could nibble it to their heart's content. Micaiah had also made a lift-up hatch in the wire on top of the run so that I could climb in. This I did immediately and gently placed my hares in their box, lay down and watched. After a while, the 2 little creatures hopped out and I could finally get a proper look at them. They were enchanting, buff-coloured with fine black speckles and pure white underparts. Their fluffy tails were black on top and white underneath. Being nocturnal, they had large eyes, and their ears were bigger than a rabbit's. Their most distinguishing feature was a snow patch, about the size of a thumbprint, on their foreheads, exactly between their ears. My sisters and I loved our new pet hares, and we spent many happy hours with them. We cuddled the fluffy baby hares and played with them for hours, as they were far more amenable than any of the cats, either our house cats or even less docile stable cats, which slunk away into their sheds and hid among the bales of lucerne whenever they saw us. These 3 cats were semi-wild, but essentially to keep down the rat population. Admittedly, we didn't try and dress the hares up in our doll's clothes more than once, because although they didn't lacerate us by ripping at us with their claws as the cats did, they wriggled straight out of the garments, lacking the proper kinds of legs to poke through the arms of little blue cardigans in the fashion of Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit. After the novelty had worn off for my sisters, I continued playing with them, giving them lucerne stalks to nibble and slivers of carrot and lettuce leaves filched from the veggie garden. Every morning Micaiah dragged their enclosure a few yards along the lawn, revealing a square patch of manicured grass where they'd nibbled each blade through the netting underneath, showing a bright green fertilized velvety surface like that of a bowling green. And he filled up their water can from the hosepipe. Even Mum was quite impressed. I wish I could get the whole lawn to look that well cut. That blasted mower could never give it such a trim, however low Begandella sets it. Once they were fully grown, the hares became too restless to be kept in captivity, so we asked Micaiah to let them go back into the veldt, where they could find mates and raise babies of their own. We were quite philosophical about it, as we knew it was best for them. And when we were coming home from polo tournaments in the dark in winter and saw a hare zigzagging in front of our car, too hypnotized by the headlights to have the sense to hop up onto the grassy bank and out of harm's way, would speculate as to whether those were our pets or, the years later, their offspring. Every night throughout all those years, we'd eat our 3-course supper cooked by Masango, all 6 of us seated at the long stinkwood dining room table, with its accoutrements of crystal and silver, fresh flowers arranged and candles lit. Each dish was served to us by Micaiah, wearing his red sash and little white wedgie cap, shaped like the forage caps worn by the American GIs in World War II. After we'd finished, if it was a clear night, the whole family would walk out onto the front lawn, us kids in bare feet, even though there was a thick frost on the grass in winter, and would gaze into the sky to look for signs of rain. It was mainly to appease Mum's constant anxiety about runaway bushfires, but was also the only really pleasurable activity we did as a family. Others usually involved a trip to Durban every 6 months to visit the dentist, a horrible ordeal. I know what you're talking about when it comes to dentists. I have to tell you something, okay? Now, I have an absolute fear of dentists, worse than the Africans have a fear of sangomas, and I'll tell you why. I grew up in Iringa, in East Africa, and I had a tooth pulled by a dentist when I was about 5 years old, and he didn't have the proper equipment. He used a pair of pliers. Yeah, seriously. No injections, nothing, just yank, 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 yank. And when I had a filling, which my teeth were going to come out anyway, the new batch, but this dentist wanted to earn some money. He had like a hand drill, and he drilled into my tooth. It was just crazy, but that's how basic things were back in East Africa in those days with a dentist, and I guess with all areas of medicine. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to the story. The only other time we 6 congregated was when we sat down for our 3 daily meals in a slightly tense atmosphere, as Mum watched our table manners like a hawk, and Dad insisted that we either made conversation of general interest or didn't speak at all. There was absolutely no light pollution in the valley, so we had the full impact of the southern hemisphere constellation. There was nothing quite like the African night skies. The Milky Way actually blazes in a full broad arc from horizon to horizon, dotted with bigger individual stars scattered here and there. and the Southern Cross stands out proudly, easily identifiable and pointing towards the celestial South Pole. Later on, after 1957, when Sputnik was launched over the ensuing years, right up until we left the homestead at New Forest in the mid-2000s, we'd gradually see more and more flashes of sunlight being reflected off satellite solar panels as the numbers being launched increased. It was always fun to see who'd be the first to spot the giveaway, intermittent flashes as one went rapidly past, rotating in its orbit, seemingly among the stars. We still do that now, sharing our experience with our children and grandchildren. Until I reached school age and used to go AWOL to join my friends instead of to the manager's house, where our governess was supposed to be teaching us every day after breakfast, we were escorted by Evelina and Alicia out to the back to a big shady area of soft green and tick-infested kikuyu grass, not too near the rubbish pit, but under the biggest gums. There they would settle down, Evelina making herself comfortable as she wriggled her large rump into the dappled shaded grass. Then she resumed an ongoing and rowdy gossip with two washing and ironing women. The four Zulu women shrieked with laughter and slapped their substantial thighs at delicious titbits of scandal. The washerwomen had a huge oval zinc bathtub with handles at each end. They scrubbed our clothes and linen on washboards, a flat board with a ribbed surface, using soft, mottled blue soap that came in long bars, and always looked to me as if they could be good to eat. They would have done the washing at the river, pounding the soapy clothes with stones on the rocks, like they did with their own laundry on Sundays, well out of sight of Mum's disapproving eyes. But my mother wasn't going to copy the Africans to that extent. On ration days, Mum would unlock her store cupboard, pull out a foot-long bar of the delicious-looking soap and hack off 4 inches or so with a sharp knife. She doled out the house servants food and cleaning rations such as Vim, Brasso and Cobra floor polish once a week, with the same grace as she did everything involving the servants and us children. "Don't waste it," she said briskly to the staff as they stood before her in the big pantry, the 4 women in the front with their eyes respectfully lowered, and Masango and Makaya at the back, the men's white uniform hats removed from their heads, being twisted nervously in their hands as they bent their greying heads to look politely at the ground. Underneath the gum trees, while the women gossiped, I became instantly bored. "I'm going to look for Donna balls," I told Evelina, looking earnestly into her face. They were Grandpa's name for pine cones, and we used them as toys like Skittles and painted the biggest ones silver to hang on our tree as Christmas decorations. "Don't go far," she said automatically, distracted by the ongoing scurrilous conversation taking place next to her, and I bolted off up into the pine plantation and then made a quick detour around the back of the hills to the huts. There I gathered my small gang of Zulu friends, and we set off to play in the river, making clay oxen. We used those viciously sharp white acacia thorns to represent their horns. Then we ran to hunt in the paddocks below the house, which had been planted with ryegrass for cattle, winter feed, and where we hunted izimbaba, or striped field mice. I'll just say that name again, I think I got it wrong. Izimbaba, or striped field mice. Now, again, I'm just going to reflect on my experience as a young man, or young boy. I could only just walk, growing up with a black nanny, and I used to play with the young black kids as a little kid, and we would go running down the road. It was just a dirt track, and there were on either side there were these like big dongas or like a big rut on the side of the road where the water, when the rain came, used to run down, and we used to climb into these ruts when they were quite deep. Some of them were down at about 6 feet. And there were the roots of trees nearby that actually crossed. It was rather like going on one of these climbing type things, you know. But you're actually underneath the level of the road, and my black mates and I, we would sort of explore through this little like it was almost like a little cave. It was so much fun. When I went back to Iringa in 2016, they'd tarred the road and got rid of those ruts, and everything was sort of like, had changed, like it always does. But the memories are always with me. Anyway, getting back to Fiona's story. With practiced ease, Doomy bashed the striped field mice on their tiny heads with their scaled-down ivisa, or knobkerry he had made for himself. We all had an ivisa, which translates directly from Zulu as making him fall down, and acted as beaters to chase the mice. With lots of yelling, "Vimba, Vimba, head them off," we pounded the ground vigorously with the heads of our avisas. The thumping noises herded the delicately patterned little rodents through the long grass in a gradually funneling V, until they made a dash past Doomy, who stood stock still like a heron, with Kiri poised for the lightning strike. He threaded the limp little corpses on a long plaited grass string, and we would collect up to 6 in a good morning. They were enchanting little creatures, with greyish buff fur. They had 4 distinct black, white and buff stripes running down their backs, which gave them their name. Their bellies were pure white, and the backs of their tiny round ears were black, as were their long furry tails. "They're delicious," he told me. "We skin them and roast them whole in the ashes." I never tried roasted imbiba, as I was far too squeamish about the idea of eating them. Privately, I loved mice and would much rather have kept the imbibas as pets. They looked so adorable. Once, when he was out with the gang burning fire breaks, Ngidi, our Induna and chief of the tribe, had found a nest of baby imbibas in the hollow of a forked tree and given them to me to raise, but they were too young, still almost hairless, pink and blind. I was only about 5 and had no way of feeding them or keeping them warm, so they all died. I was heartbroken and kept pestering Ngidi to find me a nest of older mice so that I could keep and play with. Doomy and Co. kept an ear out for the sound of the farm bell, which signalled the end of the working day, and packing up our clay oxen, the imbiba corpses of a tightly woven reed basket, oozing sweet honey that we'd smoked out of a wild beehive, we made our way back home. They too, their cosy-looking huts, with the smiling mothers stirring ufutu with a long stick over a smoky open fire, and me back to an anxious, scolding Evelina, who still had to hustle me into the bathtub and get me dressed in my pyjamas. Then into the nursery for whatever insipid spaghetti supper Masango had made for us. As far as Mum was concerned, we had been playing nicely and keeping clean all day, watching over by our nannies. Although I wasn't allowed to, I ran free for my first 12 years and loved every minute of my extraordinary day-to-day life. And I can only support exactly what Fiona's saying here. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Iringa, in the southern highlands of Tanzania. And until I went to boarding school, very similar. We had black nannies. I spoke Swahili long before I spoke English. And, we were basically let loose. I used to go exploring in the bush behind our house, because our house literally backed onto the African bush. And boy, can I tell you some stories about what happened in that African bush, but that's for another day. All right, guys, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Please ring the bell for the updates. Please like this video. Please share this video. And above all, please stay safe. Now, just so you know, I'm putting Fiona's videos into a special playlist. So they're all going to be together. If you go to the home page of Loving Life and go right down to the bottom, this is on a computer, probably won't work on a mobile phone, but you'll see the playlist of the White Zulu. And if you open that, you can then go through all the videos that I've actually done reciting her articles. All right, guys, take care. Bye for now.